Jimmy Washington, a 13-year-old boy and the son of the newly appointed chief of police in town, was on his way to visit his grandmother in the Oakwood neighborhood. Jimmy adored his grandmother's house. It was his sanctuary, filled with the comforting aroma of freshly baked cookies and the warmth of her loving hugs. While walking, Jimmy noticed 2 police officers trailing behind him. At first, he brushed it off. Oakwood was a peaceful place, and the police were there to ensure safety. But as the officers moved closer, their behavior felt more like they were monitoring him. Glancing back twice, Jimmy saw their eyes locked on him. Officer Grant and Officer Baker wore stern, intimidating expressions that sent a chill down Jimmy's spine. Jimmy felt uneasy but couldn't figure out why. Something seemed off. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and called his father, Chief Andre Washington, who had recently taken charge of the same precinct these officers worked in. Jimmy's dad had always advised him, "If you ever feel unsafe, call me immediately." That advice rang louder than ever that day. Jimmy kept walking as the officers picked up their pace, calling out for him to stop. They didn't greet him or ask him anything politely. Instead, their eyes scrutinized him, as though he didn't belong. "Hey, kid!" Officer Grant barked. "Where do you think you're going?" Jimmy swallowed nervously but answered, "To my grandmother's house, sir. It's just down the street." The officers didn't seem interested in his answer. Instead, they began bombarding him with invasive questions. Why he was in the area, where he lived, and even demanding to see what was in his pockets. Jimmy, now both frightened and confused, clutched the thought of his father arriving soon. Without warning, Officer Grant began rifling through Jimmy's pockets without consent. The only item he found was a small box holding a scarf Jimmy had bought for his grandmother. Even then, the officers continued to treat him like a suspect. Though fear gripped him, Jimmy stayed calm, holding on to the hope that his dad would get there in time. At the precinct, Chief Washington saw his son's name flashing on his phone. Jimmy rarely called during school hours or family visits, so the chief immediately picked up. Jimmy's shaky voice on the other end told him everything he needed to know. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his keys and sped toward Oakwood, praying he'd arrive before things escalated further. Meanwhile, at the street corner, Officer Grant's tone grew harsher as he peppered Jimmy with more questions. "Young man, kids like you shouldn't be wandering around here. Are you carrying anything illegal?" he pressed, glaring down at Jimmy. "No, sir," Jimmy answered, his voice steady though his hands trembled. Officer Baker, the younger of the two, stood back, uncertain but following Grant's lead. Despite Jimmy repeatedly explaining that he was simply visiting his grandmother, the officers ignored him and kept up their line of questioning. Just then, Jimmy spotted a familiar black car pulling up nearby, his father's car. A wave of relief washed over him. Before Officer Grant could ask another question, Chief Washington stepped out of the car, his face set in a stern expression. Both officers turned in surprise, recognizing their chief even though he was dressed casually. "Chief?" "Chief Washington, sir," Grant stammered, visibly unsettled. Chief Washington said nothing at first, glancing at Jimmy before turning his piercing gaze toward the officers. "Would either of you like to explain what's going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp and commanding. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Officer Grant, his face pale, fumbled for words. "Chief, we thought he looked suspicious, sir. He didn't seem like he belonged here," Grant mumbled, avoiding his superior's eyes. The chief's expression didn't waver, though his disappointment was palpable. "Suspicious? You thought my son was suspicious?" he asked, his voice measured but cutting. "This is my neighborhood. He's walking to his grandmother's house just a few doors down." Officer Baker's face fell as he realized the gravity of their mistake. "Sir, we didn't know," he said softly. Chief Washington took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. You assumed," he said firmly. "Tell me, does a young boy walking to visit his grandmother really seem like a threat to you?" Both officers stood frozen, guilt written all over their faces. From this moment forward, you will treat every person in this community with respect. The same respect you'd want for your own family, the chief declared. Today, you crossed a line. The officers nodded in silence, clearly humbled by the rebuke. Chief Washington turned to Jimmy and gave him a reassuring nod. "Let's go, son," he said, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. As they walked away, Jimmy felt an overwhelming sense of pride in his father. Justice had been served, and the officers learned an unforgettable lesson. They had harassed the wrong kid. The chief knew this wouldn't fix everything overnight, but it was a crucial step toward making Oakwood a more fair and welcoming place for everyone.